as well. In order to help us deal with some of these complications, I would like to say something about the notion of the contemporary, the concept, the noun, a term that has been much discussed in both documentary studies and anthropology in recent years. The anthropologist Paul Rabinow, in his book Marking Time on the Anthropology of the Contemporary, has written, "What is the contemporary? The ordinary English language meaning of the term contemporary is existing or occurring at or dating from the same period of time as something or somebody else." This is the sort of common sense understanding of the contemporary. But there is, he goes on, the second meaning of distinctively modern in style, as in a variety of favorite contemporary styles. And so, just as one can take up the modern as an ethos and not a period, one can take it up as a moving ratio. In that perspective, tradition and modernity are not opposed but paired. Tradition is not a moving image of the past, opposed not to modernity but to alienation. And he emphasizes the contemporary is a moving ratio of modernity, moving through the recent past and the near future in a nonlinear space that gauges modernity as an ethos already becoming historical. Now, there's a lot to unpack there, and in some sense, this course is in part a working through of this kind of problem, so we'll continue to return to it. What I will simply note here is this idea that when we describe something as contemporary, or perhaps in some other sense modern, we, on one hand, seem to be talking about. We could be seem to be talking about a specific period, right? We could say, the 19th century, the early part of the 20th century, the modern period, right? But in another sense, the modern or the contemporary, in our case, is not simply a specific period in time, like, for example, the 1920s, but is in fact more of what Rabinow calls an ethos, right? It's an idea. And in this sense, we could be contemporary with something from the 1920s if it shares something of a similar ethos to our present. And in this way, we have at once entered into this question of what Rabinow calls the nonlinear, right? And we will again continue to explore this problem or this question of nonlinearity throughout the course. Now, just to, for our purposes here, say a little bit more, so I think it will become clearer, I would like to further quote Rabinow, who says that in this light it is clear that in many domains, old and new elements coexist in multiple configurations and variations. Okay? And he goes on to say, the question of how older and newer elements are given form and work together, either well or poorly, becomes a significant site of inquiry. I call that site the contemporary. Okay, so old and new elements coexist in multiple configurations and variations. We may start to think of these documentary modalities of observation, exposition, reenactment, and so on as coexisting as various elements in multiple configurations at different times in the contemporary experience or the work of what we call contemporary documentary. So, for example, in their introduction to their edited collection, Contemporary Documentary from 2016, Daniel Marcus and Selmin Kara write, accounting for documentary in the 21st century is no simple task. Like any other attempt at periodization, trying to fit the emergent qualities, tendencies, and aesthetics of a heterogeneous filmic practice under the banner of contemporary makes us miss one of the guiding principles behind documentary altogether, that for the pioneers and the most celebrated delegates of the form, documenting the world through new audiovisual technologies has always been about finding new ways to engage with reality, giving even the earliest films an indelible seal of contemporaneity. So, to be contemporary in some sense then is to be, in a sense, reflexive, right? About both the content and or subject matter of the present, and to the very forms in which this content or subject matter is transmitted or becomes representational. It is to be reflective upon one's own implication in or distance from what is being represented. Now, finally, this final thing I want to say about the contemporary for now, following Ravenel, and building on it to think about the documentary, is that we could say that in approaching this concept of contemporary documentary, we should aspire, or we could aspire, to be both analytic, which is to say, to identify the forms and parts of the documentary, as I said earlier, expository narration, interviews, observational and handheld cinematography, reenactment, music, and so on, and the relationships between those parts. So identify the parts and identify and analyze the relationships between them. And we should also aspire to be synthetic, which is to say, observe the assemblage, the coming together, the bringing together of the relations composed and given form and meaning in their different, new, emerging, future-oriented, social, historical, cultural, and political contexts. So how do these different combinations, these new totalities of forms and parts of the documentary activate themselves and produce meaning in contemporary social, historical, political, and cultural contexts? So while being contemporary conventionally means, as I said before, existing at the same time as something else, it also means, especially for contemporary, and when we look at contemporary work, at present day work, paying attention to the historical and emergent formations of meaning that take shape both within and across time. Rather than simply being present, then, the contemporary is, in the sense, contingent and non-linear. Contingent is to say, we're not just looking at the necessary, but how things also could have been different, how things could work out otherwise, how pieces and parts could fit together in different ways and produce different assemblages, and how they could also function differently in different social historical contexts. Don't worry, we'll continue to explore this notion of the contemporary in the weeks that follow. Finally, turning to McElwee's Sherman's March, we want to perhaps consider how it engages with these questions of contemporaneity and the postmodern in our discussion. So Williams says that in postmodernism there is what she calls, quote, a suspicion of overabundant images of an unfolding present real, which she calls Verité's commitment to film it as it happens. And she says that, in fact, in these new documentaries, they don't simply produce new simulations or new, what she calls, fictionalizations, but in fact, in this postmodern moment of simulation, of ever-present images, of skepticism, of fragmentation, etc., in fact, she says, in works including Sherman's March, they work to, quote, paradoxically new historicizations, and these historicizations are fascinated by an inaccessible, ever-receding, yet newly important past, which does have depth. So she actually contrasts this concern with a history and with the depth of history, as it were, against this sort of traditional way of understanding the postmodern as this depthlessness of the image. And what we see here, of course, is a historical image on the left of the devastated Atlanta, Georgia, from General Sherman's march during the Civil War in the 19th century, the middle part of the 19th century, and then contemporary Atlanta, Georgia in about the mid-1980s that McElwee shot. And there's some sense of some dialogue that we can produce between these two different images to understand the depth of history, which is in some ways accessed, but also perhaps covered over by the glass and steel architecture of the postmodern city, in this case Atlanta. So in a footnote to her essay. Williams cites specifically McElwee Sherman's March in her consideration of this turn to history. And so she says, quote, that on one level, while we may think of Sherman's March as a narcissistic self-portrait of an eccentric Southerner's rambling attempts to discover his identity while traveling through the South, it also plays this off against the historical General Sherman's devastating march during the concluding months of the American Civil War. So let's think a bit about how Sherman's March, as a kind of as a film about history, about the South, about the General Sherman's march through Atlanta and through the South to Raleigh, North Carolina, to help end the American Civil War, how it makes its claims upon history and what types of devices it uses to produce a new kind of, as it were, assemblage of meaning, using the various devices of classical documentary, but perhaps, yes, a new kind of formation. So one of the things we can think about is its use of exposition. And as I say, the very beginning of Sherman's March is predicated on a redirection and reorientation of the expository narration of the classical documentary. McElwee shifts the narrative voice from the impersonal voice of God to his own confessional voice and personal point of view. The historical past, in this way, collides with the filmmaker's subjectivity and everyday life in the present. As Linda Williams points out, this present, or perhaps contemporary, is strangely resonant with the past. Here, to refresh our memory, is the opening of Sherman's March.
In 1864, during the American Civil War, Union General William T. Sherman began his famous March to the Sea. With an army of 60,000 men, he swept into the South, destroying Atlanta, Georgia, Columbia, South Carolina, and dozens of smaller towns. His troops plundered homes, destroyed livestock, burned buildings, and left a path of destruction 60 miles wide and 700 miles long, before finally forcing a Confederate surrender in North Carolina. Sherman's campaign marked the first time in modern history that total warfare had been waged on a primarily civilian population, and traces of the scars he left on the South can still be found.
Great. Do you want to do it once more?
Do it all, yeah.
2 years ago, I was about to begin shooting a documentary film on the lingering effects of Sherman's march on the South. I'm from the South, and all through my childhood I heard stories about how Sherman had devastated the South. My aunt even keeps a sofa in her attic, which is punctured by sword holes put there by Sherman's soldiers as they searched for hidden valuables. She says she'll never allow the holes to be sewn up. Anyway, I'd just gotten a grant to make my film, and I stopped off in New York from Boston, where I live, to stay for a few days with the woman I'd been seeing. But when I arrived, she told me she'd just decided to go back to her former boyfriend. We argued, and then I left, and went to stay alone in a friend's studio loft, which happened to be vacant at the time. Finally, I headed south to see my family and to try to begin my film.
So the film in some ways begins with an interruption, right? Or perhaps a digression, a diversion from this initial claim of traditional classical modernist authority, of a kind of voice of God over a map, speaking over a map, to a more personal, confessional, diaristic form of cinema with these very carefully composed, artful, black and white long takes and wide angle shots of McElwee in this New York loft. And intriguingly, we can see the resonance of a comment that Michael Renoff makes in his essay First Person Films, Some Theses on Self-Inscription, that are very relevant to thinking about what's going on here in Sherman's March in 1986. Now, Renoff says that, quote, "The time has certainly arrived for a reassessment, for the open acknowledgement that the subject in documentary has, to a surprising degree, become the subject of documentary." So we could say, in a sense, among other things, this notion of the subject in Sherman's March is not simply General Sherman or the history of the South or these historical references in a very traditional expository documentary, but the subject is also McElwee, right, himself and his own life, his own love life, his own, as we'll see, his own family, and of course, in the 1980s, the sort of lingering but difficult to represent threat of nuclear annihilation, which has a lot to do with, of course, the Cold War going on between the United States and what was then Soviet Russia. Another significant aspect related to this is the self-reflexivity of Sherman's March. In many respects, the film is, as I said, the self-portrait of a documentary filmmaker as concerned with himself as he is with representing a social historical object or event. And this is connected to how the film is in some ways about its own making, its own construction. At the same time, however, McElwee, I would argue, actually accesses history, to follow Linda Williams's argument, through his own self-discoveries, relationships, and experiences. That is, he accesses history by way of making a film about himself in a period of personal and also nuclear crisis. We can also see in Sherman's March how the handheld observational camera and its logic of showing life as it is also deployed, but reconfigured and brought into a different set of relationships, right? A different kind of assemblage with the expository narration, right? Or I should say, the confessional and expository narration of McElwee, right? Speaking to the camera, conducting interviews, etc. And how this, in some ways, shifts the meanings of life captured as it is to document and enter into new relationships with both his subjects as well as the social and symbolic space of the American South. And in this way, Sherman's March is animated perhaps by a tension between, on the one hand, distance to its ostensible object of historical inquiry, General Sherman's march through the South, and over-identification or intimacy and the personal. The film is at once too far from and too close to its subject, and this notion of the subject of the film is, of course, very complicated. And this also partly accounts, I think, for the film's ironic humor as well as its circular structure, which, of course, ends with McElwee, of course, still searching for, his sort of idealized partner when he returns to the North, to Boston, right, with his attraction to his teacher, which is, of course, a sort of circularity and is ironic as well. Now, I just want to show us one example of the way that observational footage in the film, through its combination with voiceover, can be sort of, as it were, recontextualized or given many kind of complicated layers of meaning in this kind of assemblage. So here is a scene from about midway through the film when McElwee has returned to this island off the coast of Georgia, I believe, to a woman that he was previously seeing who is now living with a different partner, and McElwee and the two other people are kind of forced to live together in an intimate situation that is somewhat awkward.
Cool. It's all very complicated and awkward with just the three of us living here. I want to leave, but I can't until the ferry boat comes, so for the next few days I continue to help with the chores, but somehow it isn't the same.
They don't seem really upset right now. They will be later, I think. They can only take so much of this. 10 minutes, 20 minutes. They might be like this all the time. Right now they're exceptionally docile.
Shit. Ow! Oh! God. My nights are plagued and tormented by a wide variety of insects. What little sleep I get is troubled by dreams of thermonuclear war. It seems to rain every day. Finally, I return to the mainland.
Up, down, back, down, up and down, 2.
I get a motel room, but still I can't sleep, so I watch TV. God, how awful. In an attempt to cheer myself up, I go to a local bar that has live music.
Okay, so there's a lot to work through there, and perhaps in the question, in the discussion that we're going to have in Microsoft Teams at about 5 o'clock on Thursday, we can get into some of an analysis of that scene. I also, though, encourage you, if you cannot attend or choose not to attend the Microsoft Teams discussion, to post some thoughts, comments, or questions on Sherman's March and perhaps that scene on the discussion board on Canvas. I have posted some questions already as prompts on Canvas, and these are different. The ones I have provided here in the slideshow are variations on those same questions. And I will just very quickly go through the four that I have here to set us up for the discussion at 5 o'clock on Thursday. So the first question pertains to identifying and synthesizing the different documentary strategies that Ross McElwee uses in Sherman's March. Does McElwee seem ironic or skeptical about these strategies? How is humor, I guess is another question we could relate to this, humor produced by the bringing together, the assemblage of these different documentary strategies to depict McElwee's subject, his subject being at once General Sherman and his march, but also McElwee himself. This second question I had pertains to working through a long quote from Linda Williams' essay Mirrors Without Memories. I won't read the quote here. You can access it and go through it yourself. But I will say what I want you to think about is what aesthetic and representational strategies McElwee deploys in Sherman's March explore the relationship between what Williams calls traumatic historical truth of General Sherman's march to the South to the American Civil War on the one hand, and the present-day issues of nuclear annihilation and personal loss and loneliness on the other. How do through these different McElwee's combination of documentary forms produce this dialogue between the wider social historical concerns that his film addresses, and then the very personal, intimate, confessional concerns that he also takes up in the film. My third question pertains to a quote that McElwee himself has said about the film, in which he says that he thinks, quote, I managed to get a lot of things out of my system in Sherman's March, identified a documentary filming stance in which I was not at all comfortable. That of the invisible voyeur hiding behind a camera, pretending not to be present among his living, breathing subjects. I also had my fling with pretentiousness, embedding T.S. Eliot into the narration, seeking self-serious and symbolic footage. Right, so we already see here how McElwee is saying that in the making of Sherman's Arch, he was confronting this sort of more traditional mode of observational documentary that had what they used to call a fly-on-the-wall approach, right, where the camera was supposed to disappear into the background and not be addressed by the subjects of the film. I relate this question to what we might see as an implicit critique, perhaps a gentle critique, of white masculinity in Sherman's March. For example, when the film shows us the raising of giant phallic logs in virility contests with men in kilts, for instance, or the scenes of right-wing survivalists in the South talking about needing more women for their forest compound. So this is something else for us to consider. And finally, to return to this question of the contemporary, in a sense, how are we contemporaries of Sherman's March? What do we make of the film in our time, especially in light of the continuing legacy of white supremacy, its control of the historical narrative, of monuments, etc., the struggle over these monuments in the South, and the enduring myths of American exceptionalism surrounding its history, and in particular the history of the American Civil War? So I look forward to discussing all of this with you both in Microsoft Teams as well as on the Canvas discussion board. Thank you.